They wore the tiara and the dagger at the same time. Imagine a city where the basilicas gleam like trophies, where a single family could step from a merchant house in the provinces into the very heart of Christendom, rearranging the fates of princes with a marriage contract here, an office purchased there, and, if contemporary rumor is to be believed, a cup slipped into a hand at a banquet. By the time Rodrigo Borgia put the papal tiara on his head in 1492, the name Borgia already tasted of scandal in the mouths of Rome's rivals. Within a few short years, it was a word that carried the weight of suspicion. Nepotism, simony, graft, and most damningly, murder. This is not a ghost story told centuries later for shock. It is a history of power under pressure. How a family used the machinery of the church as if it were their private household. How public ceremony and private violence braided together. And how enemies and storytellers turned truth into legend. We are going to ask the hard question the title forces upon us. Did murder become a practiced instrument of Borgia statecraft, a family tradition? Or did a combative political culture, thick with betrayal and rumor, make the Borgias convenient scapegoats for the era's savageries? The answer demands patience. It also demands skepticism. Some accusations have contemporary witnesses. Others are whispers in pamphlets published decades later. The record is a collage of registers, papal bulls and financial ledgers, diplomatic dispatches, the diary notes of clerks such as Johann Burchard, and the thinnest of street gossip set down by enemies. Wherever the archive thins, I will label it indefinido, or point to the type of source on which a claim rests. The Borgias story refuses neat verdicts. It invites a court of historians rather than a rabid mob. They began, as great dynasties often do, in motion. The Borgias, Borja in their native Valencian, were not Roman aristocrats. They were Spaniards who, across decades and continents, built a transnational career in the papal curia. Rodrigo Borgia, born into a family of minor nobility and clerics in the Kingdom of Valencia, learned early the arithmetic of advancement. Office traded for loyalty, marriage brokered for alliances, benefices accumulated like capital. He was, by temperament and talent, a bureaucratic predator, fluent in the languages of power, comfortable with cash, and untroubled by the moral acrobatics required to keep climbing. Renaissance Rome was a market where souls and sinecures changed hands as readily as silk and spices. The papacy lay at the crossroads of spiritual authority and worldly income. Cardinals were princes, and the curia ran on favors as much as faith. Simony, the selling of ecclesiastical posts, was endemic. So was the expectation that a man in power would secure his kin. For every story of saintly renunciation there was another, messier truth. The office could, and often did, become family property. Rodrigo's ascent followed that logic. A career built on alliances with powerful patrons, on the strategic placement of relatives, and on a willingness to navigate the Republic of Rome's slums and salons alike. When Alexander VI assumed the tiara, he did so with a retinue that looked suspiciously like a private household. Sons, daughters, nephews, and confidants elevated to positions from which influence could be extended and fortunes extracted. The papacy, under his reign, read less like a spiritual office and more like a dynastic launchpad. Public reaction was immediate. Rome was an arena where ceremonial display and rumor collided. Processions down the Via Sacra, sumptuous banquets, and the glitter of new appointments were the very theater through which Rodrigo announced his power. But spectacle, too, was a shield. It could mask and also magnify. In the alleys beneath the marble, families that had once accepted the patronage network found themselves squeezed, ostracized, or violently displaced. Rival houses, the Orsini and the Colonna among them, read the Borgias' rise as a threat. Their resentments would feed the narrative that Rodrigo and his kin were not merely ambitious, but dangerous. Rodrigo's methods were practical. He bought votes when he could. He exchanged favors where coins failed. He married daughters into strategic houses. He used church offices as currency. His papacy centralized patronage in ways few predecessors had dared. The message was unmistakable. The papal chair had become the Borgias' most potent instrument. Whether such concentration of power necessarily produces murder as policy is the question this story returns to again and again. Into this world, Rodrigo placed his children. There is a tendency in the modern imagination to paint Cesare as a gladiator and Lucrezia as a poisoner's handmaiden, two archetypes that make for good theatre. The historical truth is more complicated and at times painfully human. Cesare Borgia, born Rodrigo's second legitimate son, was trained for a life of clerical prominence. He took vows, he became a cardinal, and yet the cardinal's red did not suit him for long. He was restless in an age that blurred martial and ecclesiastical ambition. When the chance arose for him to exchange his hat for a helmet, to transform from ecclesiastic to condottiero, a professional soldier captain, a prince-maker in the fragmented polities of Italy, he took it. That pivot from churchman to warlord is crucial. It marked a new phase in Borgia strategy. If power could be bought and bureaucratized, it could also be seized and kept by force. Cesare's campaigns across the Romagna, funded by papal gold, aimed to carve out a territorial state for the family. He hired soldiers, forged alliances with French kings, and, according to many contemporary observers, cleaned up after battles in ways that made local opponents vanish. The moral calculus of Renaissance warfare allowed for ruthless efficiency. Civilian casualties, political executions, and brutal reprisals were not anomalies but part of the toolbox. Yet where the line between acceptable brutality and premeditated murder lay is often indefinido. Some deaths are well documented as executions, others remain shrouded in rumor. Lucrezia Borgia complicates every tidy narrative. She was a daughter, a diplomatic token, a woman whose life was traded in contracts that sealed alliances. 3 marriages, each suiting a political purpose, a reputation that followed her like a shadow. Contemporaries and later commentators painted her alternately as innocent victim, sharp political actor, and poisoner extraordinaire. The evidence is noisy. Diplomatic letters and court gossip smear her name in the same breath as they describe her embroidery and household management. Modern historians reconstruct a portrait of a woman who navigated a perilous world with a mixture of constraint and agency, who sometimes suffered the consequences of her family's choices and at other times appears to have leveraged them. Claims that she regularly administered poison are often later embellishments or originate in hostile accounts. Many of those allegations are indefinido and contested by archival silence or contradictory testimony. 2 dynamics underpin the Borgia rise and set the stage for the notorious allegations. First, the centralization of power under Rodrigo created incentives for rivals to try to unmake the family. Second, the culture of rumor and political pamphleting in Renaissance Italy created a marketplace where scandal was currency. Printing presses churned out stories that fed one another. Enemies, clerics, and foreign agents all had reasons to depict the Borgias in the darkest light. Thus, when a political opponent turned up dead, it was not only the death itself that mattered, but the narrative ready-made to explain it. Take a typical episode in this early phase. A banquet hosted in a palazzo near the Tiber. The room is warm with candle glow. Tapestries mute the stone walls. Servants move with the practiced choreography of the great houses. A rival arrives, a local lord who had once threatened a Borgia marriage alliance. Later that night, he collapses, convulses, and dies. Chroniclers will tell the story in different rhythms. Some whisper of poison in a cup. Others describe a knife in the dark. Some point to a feud in which striking the rival down would serve immediate political ends. What is clear is that contemporaries heard events against a backdrop of suspicion. Was the banquet fatal because of a deliberate murder? Was it an illness, rapid and misattributed? Or was the story shaped after the fact by enemies looking to exploit the optics? In many such cases, the verdict is indefinido. If rumor acts like tinder, the papal court added wind. Rodrigo's willingness to elevate his children, Cesare to secular power, Lucrezia through successive politically arranged marriages, and his sons to the most profitable posts, created a network of interest and grievance. When the papal household benefited, others lost. The Orsini, the Colonna, the Sforza family in Milan, and the French crown each had a stake in curbing Borgia expansion. In a polity made of overlapping sovereignties, where the line between law and private enforcement was porous, elimination of obstacles could be framed as criminal, political, or both. Routers of rumour included clerks like Johann Burchard, whose diaries provide some of the most vivid contemporary glimpses of papal Rome. Burchard, a German-speaking papal master of ceremonies, recorded processions, coronations, and the court's minor scandals with a clerk's precision and a voyeur's relish. His entries are valuable as primary evidence of appearances and official actions, but they also reflect the biases and anxieties of a man in the middle of turbulent times. Similarly, diplomatic dispatches from Venice, Florence, and the courts of Spain and France relay information filtered through the agendas of foreign residents. When using these sources, it is essential to read them as both record and polemic. The machinery of patronage, therefore, gave the Borgias opportunity. The political ecosystem supplied motive, and the culture of print and personal hatred supplied accusation. Combine these, and accusations of murder become almost inevitable. To decide whether the Borgias practiced murder as institutional policy requires isolating cases with sufficient documentary evidence, executions authorized by papal or ducal decree, sentences recorded in notarial books, or confessions drawn in legal contexts, from the smear campaigns of rivals and the imaginative leaps of later dramatists. Rodrigo's coronation is a study in ambivalence. The ceremony itself was spectacle at its most perfected. A procession across Rome, the exchange of oaths, the glitter of the tiara set upon his head. The man who rose to the highest chair in Christendom had also accumulated enough enemies that the triumph had the brittle quality of a gilded stage. Contemporary observers recorded the immediate public reaction. Cheers from those who benefited, jeers from those who resented the papal household's reach. It is no accident that the acquisition of the papacy immediately intensified efforts to knit the family together politically, to transform office into kinship, influence into secure inheritance. If a throne could be appropriated, so could its profits. Once the leash of papal favor tightened around cities and offices, the Borgias' opponents tasted the loss. They pushed back in the only currency they had left, words and violence. Street mobs could be turned, slander could be printed, assassination could be arranged. The relationship between rumor and reality hardened into colorless pattern. The more the Borgias gained, the louder the claim that they would stop at nothing. And yet, the first great test of whether murder was institutionalized as policy came, not from the streets of Rome, but from the political chessboard of marriage and alliance. Consider the network of marriages that Rodrigo engineered. Lucrezia was married 3 times, to Giovanni Sforza of Pesaro, to Alfonso of Aragon, and to Alfonso d'Este of Ferrara. Each match had strategic ambition, to secure allies, to woo powerful houses, or to reposition the family in the complex web of Italian politics. Each match also exposed Lucrezia to the hazards of being a political instrument. Giovanni Sforza's annulment is one such story where sex, honor, and politics entangle. The dissolution of that marriage, contested in public and penned in private letters, fueled rumors about the Borgia family's manipulative reach. Was the annulment a negotiation in ecclesiastical courts, a forced contract termination, or the result of pressure that included threats? Sources conflict. Contemporary papal bulls and legal petitions document the official procedures, but street talk colored the affair in ways archives cannot fully capture. The Sforza episode generated whispers that Lucrezia's marriages were transactions in which a woman's life was secondary to the calculation of power. Those whispers, in turn, fed into a broader narrative. When the family treated marriage as inventory, they could treat human life as expendable. Then came Alfonso of Aragon. The violence that followed his marriage to Lucrezia is one of the pivotal episodes where rumor and record collide so forcefully that historians still debate the details. Alfonso, a Neapolitan prince, represented a dangerous union. His Spanish lineage and local ambitions made him both valuable and threatening. In the spring of 1500, he disappeared. Later, his body was found in the Tiber or in a nearby lair. Accounts differ. And rumors swirled that the Borgias had his throat cut, or that he was poisoned, or that he was stabbed in a street ambush. Contemporary chroniclers wrote with relish. Enemies declared guilt. Papal defenders offered other explanations. Modern historians analyze the patchwork of testimony and reach careful, often conflicting conclusions. It is here we must pause and apply our filter. The disappearance and death of Alfonso illustrate the limits of evidence and the power of perception. The contemporaneous documentation confirms his death and the political consequences. A rupture in Neapolitan alliances, suspicion in the Spanish court, and a hardened determination among the Borgias' enemies. But whether the family ordered the killing, whether Cesare turned the knife himself, or whether a third party exploited the chaos to remove a dangerous player, those are questions with degrees of certainty that vary case by case. Several sources implicate Borgia operatives, others point to rival factions. The precise motive and manner are indefinido in aspects of the record, though culpability in the popular imagination hardened almost immediately. What made Alfonso's death more than a tragic footnote was the spectacle that followed. Accusations flew across the Italian courts. The image of a prince strangled or poisoned at the hands of the papal family had the rhetorical power to undo years of administrative goodwill. In the volatile politics of alliance-making, reputation could be weaponized. A single suspicious death could undermine marriages, break leagues, and invite foreign intervention. The Borgias had gained power by moving fast and decisively. The same quickness made them vulnerable to narratives that cast them as monsters. Cesare's reaction to the shifting politics was decisive. No longer content to act behind curtains, he rode to assert territorial control. His campaigns in Romagna, military moves meant to secure towns, subdue barons, and create a central Borgia domain, were emblematic of this new phase. These were not mere punitive expeditions. They were state-building. But the methods employed, sieges, razzias, targeted executions, looked to outsiders like a campaign to erase opposition. Where Cesare's methods overlapped with what we would call criminality depends on definition. If statecraft permitted censorship and execution as instruments of consolidation, then what he did grated against emerging ideas about legality. If instead we judge by modern standards of due process and human rights norms, many of his actions are condemnable. The crucial point remains. Whether Cesare's campaigns routinely included premeditated assassination as a tool of policy is a question historians are still sorting through. Sources that describe Cesare's cleanup after victories tend to be vivid and morally suggestive. Correspondence from embittered rivals described disappearances of condottieri and local lords. Chroniclers reported lists of names crossed off. Venetian dispatches sent to the Serenissimo's council fretted about the papal commander's hunger for territory. These are persuasive clues that violence was a central mode of Borgia power. Yet for each claim of murder, there is an administrative record of sieges, payments to troops, and legal decrees, and sometimes direct evidence of lawful executions on chargeable counts, such as treason or rebellion. Distinguishing execution from political murder requires careful reading. There is an additional dynamic that magnified the Borgias' guilt in the public imagination, the theatricality of their court. Rodrigo's Rome loved feasts, arts patronage, and the pageantry of power. Banquets, tournaments, and ostentatious building projects were messages as much as pleasures. They signaled wealth and authority, and paradoxically, they supplied the stage on which rumors could be most persuasive. A banquet becomes the perfect setting for a murder myth. Lavish food and wine, the intimacy of a shared table, the sudden fall of a guest. It is an image tailor-made for a populace that already enjoyed scandal as entertainment. Thus, the Borgias' theatrical taste fed a hunger for lurid explanations. In short, Rodrigo's papacy reconfigured power into a family enterprise. Cesare's sword translated that enterprise into territorial ambition. Lucrezia's marriages served as diplomatic tools, and the enemies they made fed the rumor mills. By the end of the decade, the Borgias had not only accumulated offices and lands, they had accumulated an impression. The question of whether murder was a family tradition remained at this stage a live accusation, plausible in pattern, but incomplete in documented proof for every case. If there is a single moment in this phase that crystallizes the mixture of fact and fiction, the mixture of policy and rumor, it is the case of Ercole d'Este's negotiations and the haggling of Italian courts in the wake of Alfonso's disappearance. Diplomats whispered of poison while official letters spoke of insults and breaches of honor. Pamphlets with salacious titles printed lurid details that were never independently verified. The public appetite for scandal convinced many that the Borgias were uniquely cruel. Yet the underlying political reality, that a family with control over the papal purse and a son commanding soldiers would be perceived as a threat, is incontrovertible. At the level of everyday life in Rome, the folds of this story show up in small but telling ways. Servants in the papal household learned to answer for missing men. Barons who refused Borgia decrees found their rights curtailed. Chroniclers recorded processions heavy with veiled criticism. A society that expected public theater increasingly read private misfortune as part of public policy. The Borgias operated in a cultural context predisposed to interpret acts through the lens of conspiracy. And yet, for all the ominous signs, some of the most damning allegations lacked the documentary core that modern historians require for definitive judgment. Where narrative fills archival silence, the result is often literary. Plays, poems, and later novels that drill the image of the poisoner and the dagger into the cultural memory. These works, powerful as they are in shaping our view, are not a substitute for primary evidence. They must be read as part of the legend-building process. This is the point at which our story must pause and consider a deeper threshold. The moment when rumor ceases to be merely reputational harm and begins to function as political weapon. When a prince is dead, what matters is not only who struck the blow, but who benefits from the death. In the charged politics of late 15th century Italy, every sudden death had multiple claimants to motive. The forensic record is often thin, the narrative is thick. In the interplay between the two lies, the Borgias is true power, their ability to make friends, enemies, and stories alike. If you want the deep dive into Cesare's campaign and the alleged murders that followed, hit subscribe. The investigation continues. The next chapter of the Borgia's tale moves out of the drawing rooms and into the battlefield, into sieges that were as much about exterminating political opposition as acquiring territory. It is where allegations accumulate like fallen leaves after a storm, bodies unaccounted for, lists of names scrawled in dispatches, and the sudden tightening of alliances as foreign kings decide whether to intervene. Here the question of whether murder was a practiced tool of Borgia policy becomes sharper, and the cost, for those who stood in the family's way, more immediate. Cesare's campaigns were not random raids. They were a program: secure towns that ringed the papal territories, displace hostile barons, and create a contiguous sphere of influence that no papal successor would easily dislodge. To do this, he combined diplomacy, bribery, and military might. He recruited condottieri, took command of troops, and used the papal treasury to fund operations that were at once pragmatic and deeply destabilizing. The strategy provoked alarm in neighboring courts. France watched, Spain calculated, Florence and Venice kept anxious notes. The violence of Cesare's tenure should be measured not only in blood, but in administrative reordering. When a lord fell, Borgia administrators inserted new officials, reconfigured tax rolls, and redirected trade routes. Political murder, if it occurred, would not be an end in itself, but a tool for remaking governance structures. Thus, to understand whether murder was institutionalized, we must examine whether killings fit into systematic patterns of replacement and consolidation. There were episodes that look, by almost any standard, terrifyingly effective. Towns surrendered. Their leaders vanished. Borgia men replaced them. Contemporary dispatches list names. Financial records show payouts. Some legal registries note executions for treason. In such cases, the line between legitimate wartime justice and extrajudicial murder blurs. If an executed rebel had been tried by the standards of his day, however summary that trial appears to us, can we classify the act as murder in the modern criminal sense? The question is as much about legal categories as it is about moral judgment. History rarely offers us clean categories. One reported incident stands out in the memory of contemporaries: the capture and subsequent disappearance of certain Romagnol barons after Cesare's entrance into their territories. Chroniclers and later commentators described lists of names that were crossed out, a phrase used by contemporaries to suggest elimination. Whether those men died in battle, were executed under military law, or were murdered by hired hands is, in several cases, indefinido. Yet the symbolism was decisive. For the enemies of the Borgias, the crossed-out lists were proof positive that the family practiced a cold administrative form of eradication. For the Borgias and their supporters, these were hard measures in a brutally practical campaign. Consider also the role of rumor in judicial settings. When a high-profile death occurred, inquisitive magistrates and foreign envoys sometimes demanded investigations. Other times, the machinery of inquiry was deliberately stalled or redirected. The papal household had reasons to limit scrutiny. Investigations could uncover inconvenient financial threads or incriminate allies. The Borgia response to probes, whether obfuscation, cooperation, or intimidation, shaped opinions. When a death remained unresolved and punishments were delayed, the gap between fact and perception widened. We must also recall the cultural theater, the way writers and artists fed and reflected the narratives of the day. The Borgias' enemies commissioned ballads and pamphlets. These texts, often aggressively polemical, cast events into archetypal drama. Plays staged in later generations recycled these images. The result? A cultural afterlife that amplified the most sensational possibilities and downplayed the mundane reality of politics. That afterlife is the reason why, centuries later, the image of Lucrezia as poisoner and Cesare as assassin became so durable. Between battlefield and banquet, between papal document and pamphlet, the image of a family for whom murder was a line item in policy took root. Yet there remained inoculating facts. The Borgias also patronized music and art. They funded churches. They repaired monuments. Their record is not monochrome. To understand the family fully is to account for how their public patronage coexisted with, and perhaps even enabled, their political ruthlessness. We reach then a key question to hold as we move forward. Who benefits from the narrative that the Borgias institutionalized murder? Certainly their enemies benefited from a smear that made Borgia authority appear illegitimate. Equally, the Borgias benefited from the intimidation that such a reputation could produce. The reputational calculus ran both ways. When the rumor mill does the heavy lifting of deterrence, a leader can govern with less visible force. Whether the Borgias relied on rumor as a deliberate instrument of policy, or whether rumor simply filled a vacuum left by secretive governance, is precisely the kind of knot historians untangle in the following episodes. The stage is set. Cesare's conquest of Romagna resumes, reputations harden, and the international community begins to choose sides. The legends accumulate. The historical record tightens, and with it, the stakes rise for each man and woman tied to the family's fortunes. It is here, as troops are mustered and alliances recalculated, that the story shifts from accusation to consequence. How the Borgias responded when the murder narrative took hold, whether by doubling down on force, by courting new allies, or by attempting to control the story through art and ceremony, will determine whether murder remains rumor or becomes practice. The next acts will show both the machinery and the myth, the public gestures and the private violence, and the moment when the papal household discovers the limits of its own reach. The troops massed, the trumpets wired the hills with warning, and the papal banners, newly embroidered, newly paid for, were hoisted above cities that had never asked to be part of a Borgia dominion. Cesare's campaign in the Romagna was not an improvisation. It read like an extension of the household ledger. Men were hired, town councils were bribed or frightened into submission, and the machinery of governance that followed conquest, the notaries, the tax collectors, the podestas, fell into Borgia hands, as clinical as a surgeon's instruments. Contemporary dispatches catalogue those moves with a sober, if sometimes anxious, precision. Envoys in Venice and Florence reported lists of towns one by one being brought under control. Local chronicles noted the sudden replacement of familiar names in civic lists. An old communal magistrate supplanted, a porzione of lands reassigned, a tax edict sent down from an office now occupied by a Borgia favorite. With each administrative change, the image hardened. This was not mere victory. This was transformation, deliberate and durable. Transformation requires a strong hand. Cesare exercised one. He moved with a mixture of military calculation and theatrical cruelty that struck fear across a region accustomed to fractious baronial rule. After a town surrendered, there were ceremonies of amnesty and the solemn entry of troops. There were also, in some cases, prompt executions of those labeled traitors or rebels. Those executions, when recorded in notarial books or acknowledged in papal letters, are among the clearest documentary traces we have of violence enacted by Borgia authority. They do not, however, by themselves resolve the deeper question. Were summary executions simply the harsh instruments of pacification and wartime justice in a ruthless age? Or did they mask a systematic program of murder tailored to political ends? To answer requires parsing evidence and motive case by case. In a number of instances, a death or disappearance coincided with a clear political gain for the Borgias. The disappearance of a recalcitrant lord opened a fief to Borgia appointment. The sudden removal of a potential rival eased a marriage negotiation. For enemies, these synergies were damning proof. For the Borgias, they were law and order. Between these competing narratives sits the uneasy archive. Two episodes, often paired in contemporary memory, illustrate how quickly legal measures blurred into darker rumor. The first concerns the fate of Giovanni, commonly called Juan Borgia, Duke of Gandia, Rodrigo's elder son by his longtime mistress. He was found dead, his body discovered after an apparent ambush or nocturnal assault. He had been stabbed and apparently strangled. The second is Alfonso of Aragon's disappearance and death, which led to violent accusations against the family and, in particular, against Cesare. Both deaths were seized upon by enemies and pamphleteers with a hunger that outpaced the available evidence. Diplomatic letters, the diary notes of court clerks, and later pamphlets gave versions, some sober, some lurid, that often contradicted one another. Johann Burchard, the papal master of ceremonies, supplied vivid entries that convey the shock of the court, but also the rumor mill's velocity. Foreign ambassadors forwarded grim gossip back to their capitals and embellished it with motive. Later dramatists embellished further. The combined effect was centrifugal. From a few unsettling facts, a narrative was assembled in which the Borgias were not merely violent, but uniquely, serially murderous. Historians still wrestle with the Giovanni case. Some contemporary accounts suspected family intrigue, others fingered external enemies. The papers of the Roman courts, for all their authority, offer only partial clarity. There were allegations, there were arrests, there were cover-ups alleged by one faction and denied by another. The record contains credible testimony that wounds were incurred by stabbing and asphyxiation. It contains less certain testimony about authorship and command. In short, culpability here is contested. Modern historians mark much of this material as indefinido, not because of disinterest, but because of the limits of surviving documentation. What intensified suspicion in these instances, what made rumor bloom into a near consensus in public opinion, was the theater of the Borgia court itself. Consider the optics. A papal household renowned for its theatrical banquets and sumptuous ceremonies presided over by a pope who openly did what previous pontiffs had done in secret: elevate kin, marry them strategically, secure their fortunes. Add to that the sudden deaths of visible figures associated with political friction, and the social imagination did the rest. If a family flaunted its power and someone inconveniently disappeared, the public's leap to the most sensational explanation was almost inevitable. Cesare's sieges were more concrete proof of force. His military style blended predatory raids with disciplined occupation. He masterfully used both officers and clerks. Punitive expeditions to cow a recalcitrant marcher, followed by notarial commissions to formalize the new order. When chroniclers spoke of names crossed out, they meant that innate bureaucratic cruelty had become literal. But again, the distinction matters. A condottiero executing a military sentence against a lord accused of rebellion is different in law and in contemporary acceptability from a secret murder of a rival to speed political advantage. The case of Forlì and its indomitable defender, Caterina Sforza, is illustrative of the moral tangle. Forlì, held by the Sforza family, resisted Borgia encroachment. Caterina, a woman of famous courage and ferocity, held her citadel with a reputation for ruthless defiance. Cesare pressed, and the rhetoric of their conflict fed both praise and horror across Italy. When he took Forlì, by negotiation, subterfuge, or siege, accounts vary and some particulars are indefinido. It was a political coup. To his supporters, it was a brilliant consolidation of order. To his detractors, it was proof of predatory ambition. The manner in which detainees and resistors were treated afterward is uneven in the sources. Some names appear in execution lists, others vanish from civic rolls. The fog around the precise chain of command in the less documented disappearances leaves an indefinido margin that will not dissipate easily. Political murder also works through intimidation, not always through outright killing. Cesare cultivated fear as policy. Stories, sometimes true, sometimes inflamed, about men gone missing after midnight, of letters threatening families, of sudden fines or attainders circulated in provincial courts. Reputation in a region where legal enforcement was inconsistent could substitute for force. The Borgias' growing notoriety served as both deterrent and weapon. Better to submit to a papal decree than to risk being the subject of a story that ended with a body found on a riverbank. Beyond the field and the banquet, the family's management of scandal was carefully orchestrated. Rodrigo's chancery produced justifications and legalese. Papal bulls and formal letters sought to frame actions as responses to rebellion or as mechanisms of spiritual governance. The less palatable tokens of conquest were often routed through intermediaries, trusted lieutenants, local condottieri, or allies from outside the immediate papal household. This dissociation, delegating violence to ostensibly independent agents, created plausible deniability. Whether that deniability masked deliberate orchestration or was simply the messy reality of medieval patron-client violence is one of those historical questions where motive is as important as act, and where motive is exactly what the archive resists. And then there is the court of public opinion. The Borgias were living in a nascent media environment that multiplied scandal. Printers, pamphleteers, and itinerant preachers cast the family as emblematic of rot within the church. When combined with personal letters that found their way into public hands, with the diary jottings of clerks and with the dispatches of foreign diplomats, the story of the murder family acquired the texture of proof. A pamphlet declared it. A singer retold it. An angry nobleman swore to it. The speed at which print culture amplified rumor was unprecedented. A slander once whispered in a Roman alley could, within weeks, be read across the Alps. Part of this reputation was constructed by rivals who had both motive and means to smear the Borgias. Families like the Orsini and Colonna had been losing influence as Rodrigo's patronage machine consolidated power. A prince reduced to pamphlets often resorts to what it can still wield: narrative. Foreign powers, too, had an interest in portraying the papacy as corrupt when it suited diplomatic aims. There were practical consequences. Alliances frayed, marriages stalled, external sovereigns wrote to the courts in Spain and France to register their distrust. In the calculus of geopolitics, reputation became a form of leverage. Among those who wrote with a mixture of admiration and alarm was Niccolò Machiavelli, He dissected Cesare as a model of ruthless political talent in the prince, praising his decisiveness and ability to command. Machiavelli's use of Cesare is complex. He admired a certain clarity of will and capacity to create rule. He did not, however, endorse all aspects of the Borgia method as morally pure. For Machiavelli, the utility, how power is gained and maintained, was the central question. That a major political thinker could analyze Cesare without making him a simple villain complicates the moral narrative. It also demonstrates how contemporaries could view Borgia violence as a form of statecraft, however brutal. That statecraft, however, contained moral and political risks. When Rodrigo's health failed and the cardinals smelled vacancy, the family's structural weakness was instantly exposed. Dynasties built on the proximity of a single strong patron with papal clout are brittle. Rodrigo's death, sudden, politicized, and immediately consequential, removed the primary engine of Borgia ascendancy. In the immediate aftermath, the papal household was plunged into disarray. Allies recalibrated loyalties, foreign powers tested the limits of the house's influence, and Cesare found that a sword without the papal purse had less purchase. What followed was, in many ways, an expected unraveling. Without papal legitimacy, Cesare's territorial holdings were easier prey. Opponents who had long fostered resentment in the courts and provinces now moved decisively. Some towns rebelled, old clients abandoned their posts, erstwhile patrons converted their animus into action. Where performance once did the heavy lifting of authority, the pageants, the sanctions, the ceremonies, force alone could not sustain the web. The same instruments that had built an appearance of invincibility were insufficient to protect the family from a coordinated backlash. Cesare's fall was swift by dynastic standards. Troops melted away when payments lagged. French patrons hesitated, courted by promises from other rulers. Italy's fractious politics reasserted its centrifugal tendencies. In this collapse, the absence of clear legal verdicts about earlier murders remained a haunting thread. For the Borgias, reputation had generated deterrence. In their hour of weakness, reputation became a liability. Accused men from distant places now sought redress. Pamphleteers sharpened their pens. New popes and anti-popes maneuvered to erase the familial imprint. Lucretia's trajectory during and after the collapse reveals the gendered contours of power and reputation. As a duchess in Ferrara, she adopted a different mode of survival, one of assimilation into a new court, cultural patronage, and careful maintenance of personal networks. The narrative of Lucrezia as the poisoner hardened in part because it fit a cultural stereotype that delighted in attributing female political power to clandestine treachery. A woman who negotiated marriages and bore children posed a narrative problem for a patriarchal public. If she had influence, what form did it take? Poison supplied a tidy explanation. Historians, reading the archival traces of her household accounts and correspondences, find a more complex portrait, one in which Lucrezia managed estates, nurtured artists, and exercised a constrained but real form of agency. Allegations of habitual poisoning are, in many cases, indefinido and sometimes contradicted by documentary silence or countervailing evidence. The family's ultimate dispersal unfolded unevenly. Some members found refuge in other courts. Others were stripped of titles. A few died in exile. The papal chair moved on. Rome's political ecosystem reasserted older balances. The narrative of the murder family, however, did not dissipate with political defeat. If anything, the defeat allowed storytellers to frame the Borgias as a cautionary tale, a family that had overreached and was punished in the cosmic ledger of history. The legend's persistence owes as much to cultural production as to political consequence. Plays, poems, and later historical novels seized upon the dramatic archetypes the Borgias offered: the corrupt pope, the ruthless son, the enigmatic daughter. Italy's own dramatic tradition delighted in moral exemplars, and the Borgias fit the bill. In subsequent centuries, artists and writers reworked the story to suit their moral and aesthetic needs, often amplifying the most salacious claims. By the time of modern history writing, the image of the poisoner and the assassin was deeply embedded. Modern scholarship, however, has been more methodical, intent on separating what can be demonstrated from what is rhetoric. Revisionist historians have pointed out the political motives behind much hostile testimony. They have emphasized that many allegedly damning sources came from cardinals, rivals, or pamphleteers, whose object was to discredit a papal order they disliked. Some historians argue persuasively that the Borgias were no more corrupt than many of their contemporaries. They simply had the misfortune to seize power at a moment when printing and political rivalries could compile a damning dossier of rumor. Others reply that the combination of nepotism, purchase of ecclesiastical office, and violent enforcement represented something beyond typical Renaissance vice, a particularly aggressive model of dynastic building that blurred the lines between public office and private family interest. This scholarly debate matters because it shapes not merely academic understanding, but the ethical reading of historical power. When we label an entire family as murderers by tradition, we risk flattening the complex social systems in which they operated. The late 15th century Italian polity permitted a kind of realpolitik in which violent measures were, if not routine, then at least available. Yet acknowledging that contextual reality does not mean absolving wrongdoings that clearly occurred. The presence of legal executions recorded in registers, the documented appropriation of lands, and verified correspondence ordering troop payments are facts that any sober account must accept. Beyond those facts, however, lie the more speculative claims that the Borgias engaged in a systematic string of secret murders ordered from the papal bedchamber. Those are precisely the claims that demand careful, granular sourcing and, where sources are missing or contradictory, the label indefinido. There is another consequence to underscore, the way in which power and story interact. The Borgias' use of spectacle, banquets, processions, lavish patronage, helped craft their image both as magnanimous sovereigns and as monstrous predators. People who saw only their pageantry could easily miss the administrative reforms or charitable endowments that coexisted with ruthlessness. Conversely, those who resented their concentration of power were primed to interpret any mishap as proof of murderous intent. The interplay of spectacle and rumor reminds us that historical reputation is not just a mirror of action, but an instrument of power in its own right. To be fair to the sources and to the historical method, we need to return to certain methodological rules. First, contemporaneous testimony is valuable but fraught. It has to be read for motive as well as for content. Second, administrative records, ledgers, notarial books, papal bulls, are often the most reliable evidence of action, but they rarely provide a full moral accounting. Third, later dramatizations, popular pamphlets, and 18th and 19th century novels are instructive for understanding the myth, but must not be conflated with primary evidence. Where documentary silence exists, historians should resist filling the vacuum with narrative certainty. So where does this leave the initial claim, murder was a family tradition? The evidence, taken as a whole, tells a nuanced story. The Borgias were undeniably adept at converting ecclesiastical power into familial advantage. Rodrigo used papal patronage to elevate kin. Cesare used military force to try to secure a territorial base. Lucrezia's marriages facilitated political bargains. Within those patterns there were acts of violence, executions carried out under wartime logic, and disappearances that remain suspicious. Some deaths have documentary traces that point toward Borgia involvement. Other deaths are contested, and the provenance of accusations is often partisan. Many of the most colorful accusations, secret poisonings at candlelit banquets, a daughter casually passing a cup, derive from sources that postdate events or originate from hostile pamphleteers. In several cases, the responsible party is indefinido. A balanced thesis, one that honors the complexity the archives afford, would be this. The Borgias were a family whose methods of power combined legal authority, financial manipulation, and, when convenient or necessary, the blunt instrument of violence. Murder, in certain instances, may have been employed as a policy choice or as a politically expedient solution. In other instances, Their opponents' rhetoric inflated normal wartime brutality into a legend of serial homicide. The idea that every triumph or every suspicious death was the consequence of a deliberate family tradition of murder cannot be sustained as a universal claim. But neither can the family be exonerated entirely. They operated in a morally compromised terrain and left behind traces, both documentary and circumstantial, that suggest a willingness to use lethal force as part of political strategy. The story ends, then, in ambivalence. The Borgias were architects of power who sometimes crossed the boundaries of acceptable violence for their time and sometimes used the formal tools of governance to legitimate harsh measures. They were both creators and victims of a rumor economy that could rapidly convert inconvenient events into moral scandal. Their legacy, consequently, is dialectical. Brilliance and brutality, patronage and predation, foundations built in marble and reputations salted with blood, real, alleged, and imagined. In the centuries that followed, the Borgias took on lives that outpaced their archival footprints. Plays made them monstrous. Biographies made them archetypes. Scholarship has attempted to separate the human from the symbol. What remains indelible is less a catalogue of proven crimes than the image of a family that so reshaped the institutions around it that rumor could readily be passed off as policy. The fear they inspired, whether warranted in every case or exaggerated in many, became itself a political tool. To some extent, the myth served power in the same way as the papal tiara once did, as a symbol that could both attract and terrify. If we must close with a blunt sentence that honors complexity without escaping responsibility, it should sound this way. The Borgias were a dynasty with an exceptional appetite for power. They used the offices of the church and the instruments of war to consolidate family advantage, and in that process, lethal force was sometimes employed. Whether murder was institutionalized as a ritual family tradition is a claim the evidence cannot entirely sustain as universal fact. But in practice, the mix of nepotism, opportunity, and a readiness to eliminate political obstacles made lethal outcomes more likely, and those outcomes, in the fertile soil of rumor, grew into the legend we still debate. There is one final irony. The very sources that accuse the Borgias, clerical diaries, diplomatic dispatches, the first pamphlets, are the same materials historians now haul into the light to reassess the family more fairly. We read the gossip, account for bias, weigh legal texts, and mark uncertainty with the label indefinido when warranted. In doing so, we do not absolve the Borgias. We situate them. We recognize a brutal age, a competitive political system in which families commodified power, and a nascent media ecology that amplified rumor into reputation. So ask yourself, as you close this chapter, did the Borgias invent murder as family policy? Or did they simply become the family to whom a violent age attached its worst stories? Perhaps the answer is both. Perhaps they wrote some of the darker pages with their own hands and allowed others to be written by their enemies. Either way, the story endures because it answers a deeper human question. What happens when ambition, institution, and secrecy collide? If this investigation raised as many doubts as certainties for you, leave a comment. Do you think the Borgias were murderers by design or the victims of a political mythology? Tell us why. If you want more deep historical profiles that balance drama with careful sourcing, subscribe and join the conversation. Suggested sources to consult for deeper verification and for sourcing contentious claims. The Diaries of Johann Burchard, Primary Sessions on Papal Ceremonies and Court Life. Contemporary Diplomatic Dispatches from Venice, Florence. And the Spanish Court, various archives, indefinido for specific codices and folios, papal registers, and notarial books for documented executions and appointments, Machiavelli's commentary in The Prince for contemporary political analysis, and modern syntheses by scholars who have reviewed the archival evidence. Specific modern historian names and bibliographic citations should be added by a historian verifying primary source references, marked indefinido, here pending archival confirmation. In the end, the Borgias remain, rightly, an object lesson about power. It elevates, it corrupts, and it hazards the truth. Murder might not have been a formal family motto, but when office, fortune, and family merge, blood, literal and metaphorical, becomes a readily available currency. The legend of the murderous Borgias, once stoked by rumor and later by art, persists because it answers the modern imagination's need for a cautionary tale where the sacred and the profane meet at the same richly set table.